In the same vein as Wendigoon reactions, we do have Into the Shadows presented by Simon Whistler today on the Holodomor, Ukraine's Soviet Terror-Famine. Now, obviously, this is one of those things that I talk about a lot, but I don't think a lot of people understand what exactly I'm talking about. They go, well, what's the Holodomor? We even have people as presented in a unsubscribed podcast reaction where Brandon Herrera did say that there were people cheering on communism outside of the Holodomor Memorial over in DC. So what is this? Why is this an issue? Why does Kip talk about this a lot, right? Well, we have Fact Boy here that will put all of that to rest. Or maybe not.
On February the 24th of this year, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of their neighbor, Ukraine, plunging Europe into the worst armed conflict seen since the Second World War and the worst humanitarian disaster since the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. The conflict represents a massive shift in the calculus of both the European and wider world order, and for the future, it'll be talked about decades after the guns stop firing. For Russia and Ukraine, the conflict is another chapter in a long history between the two countries, a history marked by episodes of acrimony and, in some cases, horrific disaster. Today we'll be looking back at the last time Russia inflicted a severe crisis on Ukraine in the early days of the Soviet Union. This is the story of the Holodomor, a man-made famine and the worst that Ukraine has ever seen.
This is definitely one of those historical events that really wasn't taught a whole heck of a lot. I didn't learn about it until just going on, doing my YouTube binges where I'll just binge a lot of history and stuff. And this is one of those that it feels like it gets forgotten alongside like Rwanda, that whole incident that happened there. Number of others, Cambodia S21. I mean, not a lot of people talk about Cambodia S21. So one of those that I feel that more people could educate themselves on.
Ukraine has a long history, one defined by its geography. The land sits at the confluence of the Eurasian steppes, the Dnieper River, and the Black Sea, all of which have influenced Ukraine's culture and past. From the times of the Greek city-states all the way through to the Russian Empire, the region was characterized by outsiders as a wild frontier inhabited by hardy people who were fiercely independent. It was also recognized as an economic powerhouse, with the black soil of the Dnieper River basin forming one of the most productive agricultural regions in all of Europe. It remains that way to this day. Ukraine has in recent years established itself, along with Russia, as one of the world's largest exporters of grain. Such richness in the soil attracts rivals, and Ukraine's flat geography made it naturally attractive to invaders, much like Mesopotamia in the Middle East. The first power to exert itself in the region was the Kievan Rus, a large trading federation that Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine tend to see as the beginning of their modern history. The next 1,000 years would see Ukraine pass between one empire after another, from Lithuania to Poland to the Ottomans to Russia. A Ukrainian national identity always existed in some form or another during this time, from the Don Cossacks, living more or less independent from the kings of Poland or the Tsars of Russia, as well as cultural figures like the poet Taras Shevchenko. But they never got the chance to form their own independent state to go along with their nation until the upheaval of the First World War. In 1917, following the February Revolution, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate the Russian throne. For the first time ever, Russia had no monarchy, and it became an open question as to what would replace it: liberalism, communism, or something else. Given that the Russian Empire was composed of many different ethnic minorities, the atmosphere of revolution that had deposed the Tsar soon spread to them in the form of nationalism. One of those minorities was the Ukrainians. Meeting in March of 1917, barely a month after Nicholas's abdication, a council of Ukrainian politicians declared autonomy, though not independence from Russia.
Wasn't the Bolshevik Rebellion? I think that was before World War I, right? My timeline gets a little fuzzy. I know that the Bolshevik Rebellion happened. I overthrew a lot of the. I think that's because the Russian monarchy came into the 1900s. The Bolshevik Rebellion happened, throwing out the monarchy, right? And thus this leads us into here where what's going to replace it. This part of the world, unfortunately, is not my forte in history. I know a little bit more about this than, say, the Balkans, But this is definitely one of those that is a very, very blank spot in my like understanding of history.
Accepted by the Russian provisional government, but the calculus changed with the October Revolution later that year. The Bolsheviks' relationship with nationalism is a bit complicated, but it was clear that many high-ranking officials, including Vladimir Lenin, saw Ukraine as an immutable part of Russia and their new Soviet Union. The Ukrainians obviously didn't see it that way, and Ukraine became a key battleground in the ensuing Russian Civil War that followed the October Revolution. The Russian Civil War is, even by historical standards, extremely complicated, and so to oversimplify, the Bolsheviks won and Ukraine was partitioned between the USSR and a newly independent Poland.
No, I had it incorrect then. So this would be the Bolshevik Rebellion because... yeah, then the split happened.
Bolsheviks set about attempting to purge the Ukrainian national identity, identifying it as separatism. Academics were jailed, exiled, or shot. The Ukrainian language in all its forms was banned, with party officials pointedly refusing to use it while still calling themselves Ukrainian. But with all of the repression happening, the true hardship was only just beginning. For the Bolsheviks would now find themselves governing a country that couldn't feed itself.
I think this is where we get into... he has another video we talked about fairly recently about the Russian mafia, their equivalent, vor being a Russian for thief, and how that kind of evolved into an organized crime syndicate, bandit organizations and stuff. Very fascinating watch, by the way. I think it's on his Into the Shadows channel as well. But yeah, no, there's a lot of world history that I feel gets glossed over. And I don't think that's necessarily the fault of an education system or educators, because there's only so much that you can reasonably teach in class, right? Like, sure, many people are taught about, like, oh yeah, well, World War I was sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But was it that the only reason that happened? No, obviously not. I mean, it was kind of the spark on the tinder that was, alliances, the Triple Entente, people kind of forgetting, I guess, what war was at that time. And that's why going to World War I, oh yeah, we'll be back by Christmas, that kind of thing. And you can even see that mirrored in J.R.R. Tolkien's work in like Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. You can see elements of that kind of go into that. Tales of war being like King Arthur, and the last, being like Napoleon, right? And then war being a very, very, very different place once World War I actually got in full swing.
From the start of World War I to the end of World War II, a period of 31 years lasting from 1914 to 1945, the Soviet Union's single greatest problem was that of food. When World War I began, massive amounts of young men were drawn from rural communities, depriving Russian farms of manpower to work the fields. Soon, the agricultural economy came under strain, and Russia began to starve. Indeed, one of the key slogans of the Bolsheviks was peace, land, bread, referring to the policies of getting out of World War I, redistributing aristocratic land to the poor, and providing food for a populace that was going hungry. The first two promises proved easier to deliver on than the third, not least because of the Bolsheviks' complicated relationship with the largest demographic of their country, the peasants. The peasants were an important foundation of the state, being the primary source of food for most Soviet citizens. During the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks simply seized grain from the peasants in order to feed the cities. If the cities starved, the Bolsheviks wouldn't survive, since the urban poor were their base of support. Shocking.
I feel like going into this, I feel like we're going to see some parallels with the US as well. Because when is the last time people really are just like, yeah, no, your farmers grow your food, right? I feel like they're kind of one of those people, groups of people like truckers, right? When's the last time you thanked your local trucker? When is the last time you thanked your local sanitation workers? Like things that we really take for granted. And yeah, you're going to complain about, the Starbucks employee getting your coffee not just right or taking a minute too long, right? And there's people that do that. I think they're dumb. But for all you are there to pay for a service. You have to wait in line like everybody else. Like it's also not the employee's fault, right? Most of the time. But I think that it's interesting because from a historical standpoint, throughout history, we do kind of see some constants when it comes to different cultures, different countries, different organizations, different empires, etc., where things like farmers, transportation workers, etc., sanitation, they're kind of just taken for granted, but they're never, they always feel like they fall to the wayside at a certain time or another. We also see the censorship of information, burning of books, banning of books, etc. And there's some books that, what is it? Lolita, the way I understand that book is a relevant ban, but it's still one of those things, like, if you are the right person in the right field and you're analyzing the text from a strictly analytical standpoint, yeah, you can analyze things like the Communist Manifesto. You can analyze things like Mein Kampf. You can analyze things like that, but you're doing so in a way that you understand this as an analysis, not necessarily that you support the ideas extrapolated within, right? So, but for a lot of people, even me saying something like, well, why aren't you outright just saying this needs to be banned and burned for something like Lolita, Mein Kampf, etc., right? It becomes a hard argument to have, where the argument becomes, in a nutshell, yeah, just book is banned, not a read. But there's an asterisk there, where if someone has the relevant, experience, education, relevant field to do that, or is just intelligent enough to be like, yeah, no, I analyzed the entirety of The Wealth of Nations, or I analyzed the entirety of Marx's Communist Manifesto. Didn't really like it, but I understand where he's coming from. I understand why he's saying these things, even though I vehemently disagree with it from a personal standpoint. There's a difference there. Lack of education also becomes a thing that you see in a constance throughout history as well. So in here, before the Holodomor is really kind of in full swing, we can kind of see some of these things coming into play, not just one or the other, not just in a vacuum, but all together. And it ends up twisting into this tightly woven fabric where it becomes a situation that becomes impossible to really address in subtle means. What's happening?
This had the effect of turning many peasants against the Bolsheviks, but even before that, many were already not keen on the new communist state. Some were old-fashioned conservatives who didn't like the anti-Christian stance of the Bolsheviks, while others were pro-socialist but anti-Bolshevik. Altogether, this left a pillar of society that was overwhelmingly either apathetic or actively against the new regime. This was baffling to the Bolsheviks, as they believed that the poor peasantry would have naturally supported them. And so, where persuasion failed, they used force. Any peasants who opposed the Bolsheviks were labeled a kulak, a derisive word that referred to well-off peasants who owned land, and many people found themselves on the wrong side. Ukraine, in particular, was hard hit by these crackdowns, with some villages having hundreds massacred, or even their entire adult male populations wiped out as a form of retaliation, sometimes for as little as the killing of a single Red Army soldier. Following the end of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks realized they could not safely ignore the peasantry, particularly those in Ukraine. They had to be kept under control, but they should be also formally included in the state's communist ideology, which was originally limited to just the urban workers. To that end, the Bolsheviks identified the peasantry and the workers as one and the same, symbolizing their supposed unity in an icon known the world over. The famous hammer and sickle emblazoned on the Soviet flag in 1922. The system did work, at least in holding down dissent, but it didn't fix the fact that Soviet Union was starving. Hundreds of thousands of people were still missing from the farmlands, and this, combined with the Bolsheviks' confiscation of grain from the peasants and a bad harvest, started a famine in the years of 1920 and 1921.
That's really close to... actually look it up. I think this coincides with the Great Depression in the US, but I need to verify that. I always get those dates mixed up. No, I'm sorry. The Great Depression happened at the end of this decade, so 1929 to 39, according to Google AI. If I go to a more credible source, credible quote unquote being Wikipedia, I do see 1929 to 39. I just don't like using Google AI because it can hallucinate. I actively try to avoid using Google AI. Roaring 20s leading into the Depression. So this happened effectively in the beginning of the decade, where the actual Great Depression in the US happened at the end of the decade.
Hundreds of thousands of people left their homes in search of food, and it was estimated that between 2 and 5 million people died, including 250,000 and 500,000 Ukrainians. Faced with the scale of the problem, the party leadership grudgingly made the call to allow foreign charities to distribute food aid, including an American one led by future President Herbert Hoover, which alleviated the worst of the problems and no doubt saved many thousands of lives. Following the famine, Russia was the most peaceful it had been in a decade. It was also horrifically scarred. Millions were dead, and many more were living in poverty. Hundreds of thousands of orphan children roamed the streets of cities, abandoned by the state and by society. As Vladimir Lenin described it, Russia as a country resembled a man beaten to within an inch of his life. Furthermore, the agricultural sector still wasn't stable, with rising industrial prices and falling food prices causing farmers to lower their output in an episode known as the Scissors Crisis. Despite his notoriously opinionated personality, even Lenin recognized that it would take some desperate measures to help the country recover. So for the first time in his life, he took the pragmatic approach, permitting limited private enterprise to boost the economy. This new economic policy, or NEP, was controversial among Bolshevik circles, particularly with a certain Leon Trotsky, who criticized it as going against Marxist orthodoxy. But
I mean, at that point, right, we have the point where, are we not engaging in some form of capitalism in what is supposed to be communist, the communist Soviet Union at this point, to which in itself could outline flaws with the system as outlaid, right? I think that that's not a stretch, but then you definitely see where it's like, yeah, no, this is going to be controversial because this goes against our core ideology for the Soviet Union. So at that point, people needlessly need to suffer because of adhering to an ideology.
The foremost Bolshevik of them all was beyond reproach, and so the NEP went forward. The NEP itself is rather complex, but it was essentially state capitalism on the model of China's. The other important point is that it worked, at least for a while. True, the country was essentially starting from zero, meaning things could hardly have gotten worse, but from 1922 to 1925, production in most sectors, particularly in agriculture, increased greatly. Inconveniently, around this same time, Lenin's health rapidly deteriorated, and then he died. This left his new country in a state of contention as to who would succeed him, and by extension, what direction the government's policies would take. It is at this point that our next character enters the picture.
Stalin? Yeah.
Joseph Stalin was named General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922. This position allowed him to slowly build allies throughout the apparatus of the Soviet state by giving plum positions to those aligned with him. Stalin proceeded to patiently wait in the background following Lenin's death and eventually emerged as the most powerful figure in the government, forcing all his potential rivals out of politics.
It really does make sense, some of the choices and decisions he makes, with the understanding, or at least through the lens, that he was aligned in some way, shape, or form with the Russian mafia. Like, just looking at him through the lens of being a gangster makes him as an individual make a lot more sense, at least to me.
That, of course, would not be the end of the story for many of them, but there were more immediate ramifications from Stalin's rise. First, Stalin did not believe in the new economic policy that had helped to stave off hunger in the earlier decade. At first, he had supported the policy, but that was only because Trotsky had opposed it. Once he was gone, Stalin turned around and denounced the policy just as Trotsky had done. By this point, the cracks in the policy had caused once again an unproductive agricultural sector. Stalin believed that any grain crisis was best solved with force, in part because of the second big change that came with Stalin: paranoia. Stalin was famously paranoid, constantly worrying about plots, conspiracies, and threats, inside and out. He believed that the capitalist West would one day mobilize to crush the Soviet Union to protect themselves against the revolution. He believed that the USSR's neighbors, including Japan and Poland, were secretly fomenting nationalism in Ukraine to undermine Soviet rule.
So I will add here, I will add the interrupt as far as the general from World War II. He was I always forget his name. It's not MacArthur, because he was Pacific. He was in the European theater and said that the Soviet Union would have to be dealt with in some way, shape, or form. Like, World War II wasn't over until the Russians were dealt with. And then mysteriously he got into a car crash, allegedly, is how that goes. So when you think about that, regarding if that statement is public or not, I mean, that can absolutely feed some of this ideology that Stalin had. I'm not defending Stalin. What I can't, Pat, thank you. I literally always forget it's Patton who says that. But if that was a public thing, if that was a statement that, the Soviet Union would have heard of, I mean, I don't think it's an illogical conclusion, especially if Stalin does have paranoia in some capacity, to come to that conclusion that the capitalist, the West, the Ren and Stimpy clip, capitalist pig, Russian dog. Oh man, that was a kid show. But like, you get what I'm saying, right? Is like that would make sense. And then this is why statements leading into foreign policy in general can be a really, really tricky minefield to navigate.
Believed the world was out to get him and his country. So, what did all this mean? Well, it meant that when Stalin ordered the secret police to start arresting grain traders and to search peasant homes, the discovery of large quantities of grain being held back from the markets caused Stalin to believe that a conspiracy was afoot. He dismissed the idea that people had logically decided to wait until food prices went up to sell their grain for more money. No. To him, this was evidence that he was right, and the counter-revolutionaries were holding back the Soviet Union, most notably the kulaks.
So, and this is why you don't surround yourself in an echo chamber. This is why you surround yourself with people who are intelligent, who are able to call you out on your BS when it needs to be called out. Because this is exactly what an echo chamber leads to. It leads into, well, I'm right. Am I right? Yes, sir, you are right. Yeah, I'm right. And then you're effectively unchecked, right? Anything that I say, anything that is said to me, I always come under the lens of, am I incorrect, right? Am I in some way, shape, or form wrong? And then there's some things that I hear and I'm like, no, I'm absolutely correct. That's dumb, right? Such as an argument being made about, well, it's okay for teachers and underage students, that's okay. No, it's okay. Am I wrong? No, this person's wrong. Yeah, no, this person's wrong. I'm right. Right, that kind of thing. But if somebody brings up the understanding of where we're talking about the finer points of Stalin's reign, right? And I say something along the lines of Stalin's a gangster, and someone comes in and goes, actually, I mean, he really wasn't. Insert XYZ logic here, and they have sources to back it up, or they can actually point to things that point to him not actually being affiliated with the mafia. Wow. What a reasonable concept. Hey, you've brought information to my attention. It has proven me wrong. Thank you for that. But yes, this is an extreme end of the dangers that happen when you surround yourself with an echo chamber. And I would very much advise people self-reflect if they are worried about being in an echo chamber.
Thorough demonization of the kulaks had continued apace during the 1920s, but kulaks continued to be the most productive farmers, building larger estates than the other peasants. Stalin recognized this and concluded that the secret of productivity in agriculture was scale. This actually was the opposite of the reality. Larger estates came from productivity, but it worked for Stalin ideologically and politically. He wanted the Soviet Union to industrialize as soon as possible, believing that it would make the state more powerful and more communist. As such, he wanted fewer people working in agriculture while also boosting agricultural production. So, how to square this circle? Well, after having the misguided epiphany of scale and productivity, Stalin decided that he would boost Soviet agriculture through large state-owned farms and that the peasants would give up their private land to join them. Collectivization, as this was called, is well known as one of the most disastrous policies to ever come out of communism. It was tried in many countries and it failed every time, causing entire agriculture sectors to collapse and widespread hunger to emerge as a result. Stalin's collectivization was the first of its kind, and he was aware of the costs that it might impose. But he didn't care. He was building a worker state, not a peasant state, and he believed that collectivizing agriculture would make the peasants behave more like workers. But there was a more ominous reason too. In building the Soviet state, Stalin sought to crush any national identities in favor of creating a universal Soviet identity. To that end, Stalin saw the peasants of Ukraine as being inextricably linked to Ukrainian nationalism, which he viewed as a threat to the state. This threat was of course greatly exaggerated, but Stalin took it seriously all the same. Even if collectivization harmed the Ukrainian peasantry, Stalin believed that such harm would also weaken Ukrainian nationalism, securing Soviet rule in Ukraine. It's a shockingly cynical viewpoint, and it would have equally shocking consequences in the years to come. Collectivization and the accompanying dekulakization began in earnest in 1928. The effort was carried out with harassment, haranguing, and often with violence and intimidation. Millions of peasants were herded into kolkhozes or collective farms with their properties handed over to it, and they were set to work on unrealistic quotas for grain harvests. Anyone labeled a kulak was deported, often to Siberia, in the first labor camps that would later become the Gulag system.
I mean, reasonably though, like, what is your recourse? Like what is your plan going forward? Sure, we can go full on, Stalin confirmation bias, dekulakization, right? Who's going to work the farm, especially if you have insane quotas, right? Are you making that under the assumption are you making policy under the assumption that they will not meet these quotas? Is this used as confirmation bias to set people against each other in order to fuel deporting those labeled kulaks, right? Like, what is the intent behind that policy? And even then, even if the intent behind the policy, let's argue, is in good faith, as awful as I hate using that as a descriptor, right? If in good faith your argument is to stop any sort of stranglehold on food market, et cetera, right? I mean, eventually you're going to need farmers. You're going to need farmers to work the fields, till the soil, crop rotation even, right? Crop rotation being you need to put different crops in different spaces every season, every couple seasons. Because, like, for example, if you grow carrots in the same spot every year after year, like, we literally have scientific evidence that, like, shows that, yeah, no, things like this will have diminishing returns after a while because you're literally taking all of those nutrient stuff out of the soil. Certain things require different things from the soil, right? And that's why you'll have, like, carrots that season and then, like, onions that next season, like mint next season, right? Now, obviously, I'm sure that everything I've just said in regards to how that rotation works between, like carrots, onions, mint, etc., I'm sure someone's, like, has insight into that. And they're like, well, Kip, that's actually not how that works. It would actually be this vegetable, this vegetable, this vegetable. And absolutely, right? I do not have full understanding of the concept. I do, at least at face level, understand that crop rotation is a thing, and this can cause an issue when you grow the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. You're trying to apply a heavily industrialized and non-human mentality and philosophy onto not only the people, but the processes as well, right? Trying to dehumanize people. It is less that you are an individual or individuals. You are a worker for the state of the Soviet Union, are you not? So here we can see some logical fallacies even when pushing rhetoric and policy. What's the follow through? Eventually, you will just not have people to work the farms. You will not have people to till the soil. You effectively fire everyone that works in a restaurant, right? Or works in your service sector. Grats. Okay, cool. Yeah, these people who don't want to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, which I've told management on a number of occasions, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but I'm a manager. Yeah, did I misspeak? So we enter this thing where, okay, grats, we don't have anyone working the service sector anymore, but all these bank jobs are still here. All of these, automotive jobs are still here, right? Okay, but you start leading into, breakdowns, right? You start leading into breakdowns of certain systems, certain industries as well, like hospital workers. What happens if hospital workers can't get their caffeine, right? Not saying everyone in the hospital is, likes caffeine, but when you work like 19 hours and are consistently on call, you got to make through a shift somehow, right? I mean, there's a number of commentaries you can draw from this. At its core, you can look at history and you can identify where the pain points are, as well as understanding if you have something that actually can follow through, if there's a core idea that can actually have relevant and valid follow through to an end goal, or if this is just something like anti-Kulak, pro-Soviet rhetoric that doesn't really take into account what's going to happen from a logical perspective, and you end up just shooting yourself in the foot in the proverbial sense, right? Like, that's why I look at history, because there's so much you can learn, and then you can apply to different things as well.
Very few went along with this willingly. Many peasants saw the collectivization effort as a second serfdom, as in the days of the Tsar. State officials were beaten and sometimes killed. When grain was confiscated, angry mobs would storm the storage buildings and take it back. When asked to hand over their cattle to the state farms, many peasants instead slaughtered them in defiance. Still others voted with their feet. Between 1928 and 1932, 10 million peasants left the rural farmsteads for the urban factories, joining the industrial workforce. Now, none of this really made much difference to Stalin and other party leaders, who only saw that the rate of collectivization was proceeding apace. This convinced them that agricultural production was about to increase by an order of magnitude, and so the central government made a fateful and disastrous decision. They would export Soviet grain abroad, the same grain that was supposed to be feeding Soviet citizens. So let's review the events of the last 2 decades. The Soviet Union has lost millions of productive farm workers to war, famine, repression, and other things. The peasant communities are scarred and almost universally against the Soviet government, and the agriculture sector is going through a structural upheaval, lowering its productivity, with what little it produces now being exported outside of the country. The situation is absolutely primed for collapse, and collapse it did.
Eventually, yeah.
In the summer of 1932, the central government in Moscow declared that Ukraine's collective farms were required to meet their still unrealistic quotas without exception. It was gradually becoming clear that disagreeing with Stalin meant losing your job, your freedom, and, well, possibly your life, and so party officials in Ukraine set about to meet that quota by absolutely any means necessary. This meant confiscating whatever food was left in the homes of millions of Ukrainian peasants. On the collective farms, things were even worse. Peasants had everything confiscated, even down to their daily food rations. Hunger proliferated, and some started stealing. In response, the theft of state property was made a capital offense punishable by 10 years of hard labor or death. Other times, ruinous fines were levied upon anyone who hoarded or stole food, which were often used as a pretext for further crackdowns and theft of food. The entire time, the food that was being collected was being exported out of the country, and Stalin refused to change course or to alter food aid to Ukraine. No foreign charities would be allowed into the country at this time. The government also formalized a system of blacklists, whereby villages and farms that failed to meet their grain quotas were sanctioned from receiving supplies of industrial goods or raw materials like fuel. Soon, they were banned from trading entirely, meaning that peasants who lived on underperforming farms were barred from trading with or for grain.
This almost mirrors the business philosophy of denying your underperforming franchise store, location, etc., denying them newer, improved technology, services, equipment, etc. Because obviously, well, you, store number 258, have performed exceedingly well. Why don't we give you more store? Why don't we give you more, new ovens? Why don't we give you a new little salamander, right? Or new stovetops, right? We'll give you new equipment. While store 157 underperforms, and that could honestly just be due to location. Maybe it's a burger place, but big name burger place that has cheaper thing on menu comes in like right next to it, so people go to that, and then thus you see while in a vacuum, yes, absolutely, you're underperforming. What are factors in that area that can lead to a decline in this? So the reason I bring this up is that does mirror that philosophy where you will effectively pigeonhole something that is seen as underperforming or viewed as underperforming. It gets pigeonholed, and it makes it harder for it to climb out, whereas the things that are performing just get everything and anything needed to succeed. But it's depriving anything and anyone that is underperforming from a chance, right? So that's interesting. This also led to, and I think he touched on it already. This led to people who were suspected of withholding grain, right? No, I'm not withholding grain, but now you have policies like this coming into play. So, well, I wasn't hiding grain before, but now clearly I need to feed my family, and we're just exporting grain. So now I'm just going to go hide all this grain. Where you can enforce policies and just have philosophies like this that, while you're worried about something, that thing is not happening, or at least not on a grand enough scale. But now that you've done it, you've kind of said the quiet part out loud, and now people are doing the very thing that you were trying to fight in the first place that they en masse weren't doing before. As it turns out, the more you try to dehumanize things, the more human people become and react to the situation.
Essentially, entire villages were outlawed from possessing food. The famine was largely localized within Ukraine. One Ukrainian worker remarked, "Interestingly enough, beyond Kharkiv, where Russian territory starts, there was no hunger." Wandering Ukrainians searching for food found little sympathy in the neighboring Soviet republics of Russia and Belarus. In response to this flight, Stalin simply closed the Ukrainian borders, and any Ukrainians found outside of the country were returned to it. Thousands of people who had fled the starvation were sent back to it. In addition, a new internal passport system was introduced, tying Ukrainians to the lands they lived on, just as serfdom had done. All the while, mass confiscations continued apace. Peasants were encouraged to inform on their neighbors if they had food, in exchange for up to a third of what was taken. As the hunger deepened, more people began taking the deal, selling out their neighbors so their own families just wouldn't starve. Anyone who tried to resist was beaten or tortured, with the common method being to slam people's hands indoors. Others had their clothes taken before they were thrown out into the winter snow. There was widespread suffering. Any livestock that remains was led away or slaughtered. Even pets, including cats and dogs, were killed for food or killed and then confiscated. The suffering soon turned to dying, to the point where even being alive was reason for suspicion. If no one in a family had died, that meant the family had food, and they were harassed by local party activists for it.
This literally becomes a situation of, you can't disprove this, right? Well, no member of your family recently has unfortunately passed away, so you're clearly hiding food. You're clearly doing well. Excuse you? What do you mean? Well, you can't disprove it because all of you are still clear alive, so clearly there's a plot going on here. You see how degenerative that logic is? How degenerative and deplorable and even depraved that rhetoric is? That is a recipe for disaster, especially when every action is met with a negative reaction. If you don't resist, you're beaten. If you do resist, you're beaten. It becomes degenerate really fast, and then you'll have people click up, bunch up, you ratting out their neighbors for a third of the food recovered, if any was recovered, and that's if the state decides, yeah, hey, because here, have this. Is what stops the state from confiscating it at that point. It's a degenerative downward spiral.
Humanity that bound these communities together was ripped apart in the face of the starvation. People who had otherwise been kind or generous to one another suddenly treated others with spite or even hatred. Even family members weren't safe. Relatives were thrown out of houses for being burdens or murdered for stealing food from the house. Children stopped listening to their parents, or parents abandoned their children, unable to bear watching them starve to death. And even worse things happened too. At one point during the famine, authorities put up posters declaring, "To eat your own children is a barbarian act." The most harrowing message of all was that these posters needed to be put up at all. Cannibalism was reportedly widespread during the famine. Some say that the practice became normalized out of extreme need, while other, mostly first-hand accounts say that the incident almost always inspired intervention from the community. Over 2,500 people were tried and sentenced for eating other human beings. And yes, sometimes it was their own close family. Early on, there was some violent pushback in the form of attempted murders on party officials, but that didn't last long as the famine grew worse and the starving people became simply too weak to fight back. They had no energy to resist or even be angry about the situation. What started out as widespread rage and anger became collective apathy and indifference. Vasily Grossman described the phenomenon as such. In the beginning, starvation drives a person out of the house. In its first stage, he is tormented and driven as though by fire and torn both in the guts and in the soul. Then a day comes when the starving person crawls back into his house, and the meaning of this is that famine, starvation, has won. The human being cannot be saved. He lies down on his bed and stays there. In the eyes of many, these starving people were as good as dead. People who weren't even dead yet were carried off on corpse carts in a grim echo of a famous Monty Python sketch. Some were thrown into mass graves still alive and buried. Few tried to help them. So this continued for more than a year, until the spring of 1933, when the shortage of food subsided at last. The central government finally approved food aid to Ukraine in May of that year, using food that had originally been confiscated from those same peasants. The harvest came up well, at least when considering the decimation of the peasantry, and the government phased out its grain requisition for a percentage-based tax instead, meaning peasants were no longer robbed of their entire food supply to meet unrealistic quotas. With this, the famine subsided slowly over the summer and fall of 1933. The final death toll of the famine is unclear, but it ranges from 2 million on the low end to 10 million on the high end.
I want to point out that variance. 2 to 10. That's not like, 7 to 8 or 4 to 5, right? 2 to 10. That is how catastrophic it can be.
The real number is likely between 3 and 5 million. Out of a population of 31 million, that meant that more than 1 in every 10 Ukrainians were killed by hunger, a hunger that was deliberately aggravated by the man in charge through policies that were misguided at best and malevolent at worst. Beyond the death toll, many thousands also succeeded in leaving Ukraine, and generations of people have never returned. Following the end of the famine, Soviet authorities unsurprisingly covered up the true death toll of the disaster. They blamed the kulaks and nationalism for the disaster. In public, nobody acknowledged the famine, not even those who had lived through it, either because of fear of speaking out or a desire to forget the entire thing. Some kept diaries, hiding them from the authorities. The suffering inflicted on Ukraine by the Holodomor was not the end of the pain. A mere 10 years after the famine's end, the Wehrmacht of Nazi Germany would march through Ukraine, subjecting it to one of the harshest occupations anywhere in Europe. After World War II, Ukraine finally entered what could reasonably be called a peaceful time until the disaster at Chernobyl nuclear power plant put a final punctuation mark on Ukraine's Soviet history. It's little surprise that Ukraine was instrumental in the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Today, Ukraine has a holiday, Holodomor Memorial Day, on the fourth Saturday of every November, to remember the year that inflicted so much loss. With its language, its history, and its culture, it is clear to everyone in the world not named Vladimir Putin that Ukraine is a nation with a long history of suffering, but also a long history of pride. That makes the Russian invasion of Ukraine, including the besieging and starving of Ukrainian cities, all the more criminal. One can only hope that when the guns stop firing, it'll be for the last time.
So when we have an episode of the Unsubscribed podcast that Brandon Herrera talks about, we have a number of people, college students even, discussing communism, saying, oh, it would be so great, literally next to a memorial in Washington, D.C. about the Holodomor. I do take issue with that. I think that the more and more I dwell on subjects in general, lack of education is a choice. In fact, if you are curious about videos like this, Simon Whistler, excellent individual, excellent person. I've been binge watching him for just before this video the past week and a half, because he puts out a lot of great work and he has a very matter-of-fact approach. I mean, his nickname is Factaboy, allegedly, on the Blaze. But education, or I guess lack thereof education, is a choice. And even then, I can already see the unfortunate comment section of this video. Even then, throughout the video, we have a number of people back and forthing with politics, modern politics, trying to insert things. And that's, as it turns out, I have these conversations. I intake this content when I'm not on stream. I'm able to look at things like Rwanda, look at things like Cambodia S21. I can look at things like the morals and ethics of Wa State within Myanmar. And, I can intake this information, have a critical adult understanding of the situation, and come to my own conclusions that are reasonably educated for such a brief overview of the situation. I don't claim to ever be a specialist on it, but at the very least you could argue I'm at minimum informed on a lot of things. So when I see that it just becomes a, us versus them mentality, or even something like this that happened, 80 years ago, becomes so polarized and even politicized, which, I mean, clearly Communist Party back then, right? It just de-incentivizes people like me to have these discussions. And I've said a number of times, if you are educated, if you are well-researched, if you have that critical and cognitive understanding, those actual thinking skills, sure, I've had a number of these conversations with a number of people. However, it is necessary to have that education. Do I necessarily bug someone who is a nuclear physicist with, do I necessarily pester them with questions about the Demon Core and stuff like that? No, they have much better things to do with their time. I can go, wink, wink, watch YouTube videos by excellent creators like Simon Whistler, who can go over things like this in a very matter-of-fact approach. So, this is the showcase. One, I do have these discussions, and I do take what I say very seriously, especially when we do have people who just do not understand what they're advocating for, and especially in the face of a monument like that. That education, lack thereof, is a choice. I'm not going to be nice about that. We had a recent reaction where we pointed out that on Twitter there was this alleged interaction where someone's husband didn't understand what a tariff is. I disagree with that. You are an adult. You have ready access to the information, books, texts, specialists, videos. You should know what it is. That is a reasonable expectation of being an adult. If I, as a dingus on the internet, can at some level understand the Holodomor, and why a lot of people, like the Fat Electrician, Brandon Herrera, the Unsubscribed Podcast, do not look kindly on it, using this as a prime example, it's not a hard reach. And it extends beyond, well, communism bad, but why is it bad? Why do people look at it negatively? Well, let's just start with the Holodomor. Let's start with collectivization. Okay, we can absolutely go from here, right? Being able to construct that argument, though, is a skill that a lot of people do not have anymore. And that is why I don't have these conversations a lot. It is one thing to say, communism bad. It is another to understand the tragedy, a completely preventable tragedy, to understand that and use that to articulate your point and do so in a respectful and educated manner. That's the difference here. But I do want to thank Simon Whistler for continuing to make just such amazing content. I have been binging some of his content. I don't react to everything. Obviously, that would be an actual job in itself just to react to Simon Whistler. And I think that devalues the content. I wanted to go into this to kind of extrapolate and experience, extrapolate and explain certain things, but also to kind of use it as and I'm sure you can see from the chat throughout, there's a lot of not to get political and not to, one way or the other ideology when we're discussing this in a historical sense. Why a lot of these discussions become hard to have. But you should definitely go check them out. I do have a link to Into the Shadows down in the description, as well as this original video, which I definitely recommend that you check out. And if you don't understand the Holodomor, I do recommend that you at least familiarize yourself with the concept of it, the overall base content. Because there are many things like that. Am I saying you necessarily need to subject yourself over and over to harsh content like this? No, but ignorance is a choice. Lack of education is a choice. And we all can strictly do better. So thank you all for watching. Thank you, Simon Whistler. I'll see you in the next one.